Welcome to Libyth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in ancient Japan with the Nihongi, the Chronicles of Japan. Today we close the week with the ideas, the themes underneath the Nihongi, and what they leave us with. We've read the Nihongi, looked at how its story is built, and sat with the characters who carry it. Today I want to go to the deepest layer, the ideas. What does this text actually believe about how civilizations work, how authority is legitimate, and what it means to be a nation in a world of other nations? And where do those beliefs pull against each other in ways the text cannot fully resolve? The central tension of the Nihongi is different from the Kojiki's central tension. Where the Kojiki wrestled with the relationship between order and the forces that threaten it, between the sacred cosmos and the disruptive energies that both endanger and generate it, the Nihongi wrestles with a different and in some ways more contemporary question. How do you become modern on someone else's terms without losing your own identity? How do you absorb the tools, the forms, the institutional architecture of a more powerful civilization, while insisting that you are not that civilization's satellite? How do you be legible to the world and irreducible to the world simultaneously? That question runs through every theme we are going to trace today. It is the thread that connects the Nihongi's account of international influence to its account of centralization. That connects its construction of a national history to its preservation of indigenous religious tradition. That connects its borrowed Chinese form to its insistently Japanese content. Hold that thread as we go. The first theme, international influence and the construction of identity. The Nihongi is, at a structural level, a performance of cultural confidence. And performances of cultural confidence always contain within them an acknowledgement of the anxiety they are managing. Japan in 720 CE was a civilization that had spent 2 centuries systematically borrowing from China and Korea, and the Nihongi was the document that said, "We have done this borrowing. We have made the borrowed things our own. And we are now capable of producing a document that demonstrates our membership in the community of civilized states." The most explicit moment of this performance is the episode involving Prince Shotoku's letter to the Sui court in 607, preserved in the Nihongi in full. The letter addresses the Sui emperor as the son of heaven in the land where the sun sets, and the Japanese ruler as the son of heaven in the land where the sun rises. 2 suns. 2 heavens. 2 sovereigns at the center of their own cosmological orders. The Sui court was apparently displeased. Chinese historical sources record the emperor's annoyance. The Nihongi preserves the letter and omits the annoyance. That choice is the argument. What matters is that Japan made this claim, not how it was received. The assertion of parity is the point, regardless of whether parity was accepted. That episode encodes a theory of identity that is still recognizable today. The theory says, you do not become a civilization by achieving the approval of other civilizations. You become a civilization by acting like one, by producing the documents, performing the rituals, conducting the diplomacy, and making the claims that civilizations make. You claim sovereignty, you claim antiquity, you claim the right to be addressed as an equal. The Nihongi is the institutional expression of that theory, and Prince Shotoku's letter is its most concentrated single expression. The tension here, and it is a genuine tension the text does not fully resolve, is between the universalism of the borrowed tools and the particularity of the identity being asserted. The Nihongi is written in classical Chinese. Its form follows Chinese historiographical models. Its dating system is calibrated against Chinese astronomical records. Its political philosophy draws on Confucian and Buddhist frameworks imported from the continent. And yet it insists, at every level of its content, on the irreducible distinctiveness of Japan. Its divine origin, its sacred geography, its lineage of emperors descended from Amaterasu, its particular relationship with its kami. You cannot fully use someone else's tools to assert your own identity without the assertion being shaped by the tools you are using. The Nihongi manages this tension elegantly, but it cannot dissolve it. Every Japanese dynasty, every post-Meiji modernization, every post-colonial nation-building project faces the same irresolvable version of this same problem. The modern resonance is direct and immediate. Every society that has modernized through intensive cultural importation, and that includes virtually every non-Western society in the 19th and 20th centuries, has faced the question the Nihongi was built to answer. Can you adopt the forms and tools of another civilization's modernity without being defined by them? Japan in the Meiji period adopted Western constitutional government, Western military organization, Western industrial technology, and simultaneously insisted on the uniqueness of the Kokutai, the national polity organized around the divine emperor, as the thing that made Japan irreducibly different from the West it was adopting. The structure of the claim is identical to the Nihongi's. The form is borrowed, the content is insistently particular. Whether that insistence on particularity is stable, whether it can be maintained indefinitely against the homogenizing pressure of borrowed forms, is a question both the Nihongi and the Meiji project left unanswered. The second theme, centralization of authority and what it costs. The Nihongi covers the most dramatic political transformation in early Japanese history, the replacement of a clan-based dispersed political order with a centralized bureaucratic state, and it covers that transformation from the perspective of the centralizing force. It is a document written by the winners, celebrating what the winners won, and presenting the victory as both historically inevitable and morally justified. The centralization argument in the Nihongi rests on two pillars. The first is the moral pillar. The clan-based order was corrupt, prone to the accumulation of power in the hands of individuals who used it for personal or clan advantage rather than for the welfare of the realm. The Soga are the exemplary case, a clan that began as supporters of the imperial institution and ended as its captors, using imperial marriages and ministerial appointments to establish what was effectively a hereditary regency. The Ishi incident's violence was, in the Nihongi's account, not merely a palace coup, but a restoration, the correction of an imbalance that had accumulated over generations. The centralized state the Taika reform began to build was not a new thing imposed on Japan by force of will. It was the proper order restored. The second pillar is the efficiency pillar. A centralized state can do things that a clan-based confederation cannot. It can conduct a national census. It can tax the population uniformly. It can build roads and granaries and maintain them. It can mobilize military resources quickly and direct them where they are needed. It can conduct sustained diplomacy with foreign states as a unified actor rather than as a collection of competing interests. After the catastrophic defeat at Beikgang in 663, when Japan's military intervention to save its Korean ally Beikgang ended in the destruction of its fleet by the Tang-Silla alliance, the need for a state capable of organizing a coherent national response to external threats was no longer a theoretical argument. It was a lesson written in the timber of sunken ships. The Nihongi is honest about both the necessity of centralization and the violence it required. The Ishii incident is recorded as assassination in a sacred ceremonial space. The death is sudden. Blood is shed where blood should not be shed. The empress is alarmed and retreats in distress. The Jinshin War is recorded as a civil war with real military campaigns and real dead. The incorporation of provincial clan territories into the imperial administrative apparatus was not, in practice, always the peaceful reorganization of willing subjects under a benevolent central authority. It was, at the margins, coercion. But the Nihongi does not dwell on this. Its moral account of centralization presents the resistance to centralization as the problem to be solved, not as a legitimate defense of local autonomy, cultural diversity, or inherited rights. The clans that maintained independence from the imperial apparatus are recorded as obstacles to the proper order, not as alternative visions of how Japanese society might be organized. The Nihongi is the account of a victory, and victories tend to write histories in which the alternative to the victor's project was not a different legitimate order, but simply a failure of order. The tension the Nihongi cannot resolve. It celebrates centralization in the name of the common good, the welfare of the realm, the stability of society, the protection of ordinary people from the arbitrary power of local clan lords, while being produced by and for the court aristocracy that benefited most from centralization. The ritsuryo system's principle that all land belonged to the emperor was, if fully implemented, a revolutionary act in the interests of the ordinary farming population. It meant direct legal standing, uniform taxation, protection against arbitrary local exaction. In practice, it was immediately compromised by the same court aristocracy and Buddhist institutions that commissioned the Nihongi, who accumulated private estates, exempt from the imperial tax system, within decades of the reform's promulgation. The centralization the Nihongi celebrates was partially real and partially aspirational, and the gap between the aspiration and the reality was managed by the same institutions that produced the text celebrating the aspiration. The third theme, the negotiation between the sacred traditions. The Nihongi covers a period in which Japan navigated between two fully formed religious systems, the indigenous Kami tradition and the imported Buddhist cosmology, and found a way to maintain both simultaneously, without the explicit conflict that the presence of two incompatible claims to ultimate truth might suggest. What made this negotiation possible was the different functional territories the two traditions occupied, and the Nihongi's account of their coexistence reflects a pragmatic eclecticism that is genuinely remarkable. Buddhist institutions provided what the Kami tradition could not: written scripture, a systematic theology of death and rebirth, a Pan-Asian institutional network that gave Japanese Buddhism prestige and connectivity, and a framework for statecraft that had been developed by generations of Buddhist polities across Asia. Buddhist monks could be state employees. Buddhist temples could be administrative centers. Buddhist rituals could structure imperial occasions. The efficiency arguments for Buddhism as a state religion were real and were exploited. The Kami tradition provided what Buddhism could not: the sacred genealogy of the imperial line, the divine origin of the Japanese islands, the local specificity of the relationship between particular places and particular Kami that organized the religious life of ordinary communities across the archipelago. The Kami tradition could not be replaced by Buddhism without destroying the sacred foundation of the imperial institution itself. Because the imperial institution's authority rested specifically on the claim of divine descent from Amaterasu, a kami, not a Buddha. The Nihongi's account of this coexistence is not a theory of syncretism. It is a record of pragmatic management. Different occasions required different ritual frameworks. Imperial succession ceremonies drew on the kami tradition and its sacred regalia. State protection rituals increasingly used Buddhist liturgy. The same ruler who built Buddhist temples maintained the kami shrines of Ise and Izumo. The Nihongi records both without apparent tension, because the text's purpose is not to resolve the theological question of how two religious systems can simultaneously be true, but to record the political and institutional arrangements through which they were made to coexist in practice. The pushback worth naming: the coexistence was not entirely without conflict. The Nihongi records episodes in which Buddhist monks claimed political authority that the court found threatening. The case of the monk Dakyo under Empress Shotoku, which occurs after the Nihongi's coverage, but casts a long shadow over the period. And the chronicle's promotion of Buddhism is always accompanied by an insistence on imperial control over Buddhist institutions. Buddhism was welcome as an instrument of state. It was not welcome as an independent source of political authority that could challenge the imperial line. The relationship between Buddhism and the imperial institution was productive precisely because it was clearly hierarchical. The emperor patronized Buddhism. Buddhism did not govern the emperor. The fourth theme: history as argument. The Nihongi is one of the first documents in Japanese history to make an explicit claim to historical accuracy, to position itself not merely as a record of tradition, but as a chronicle verified against astronomical records and foreign sources, scholarly in its method, and therefore credible in its conclusions. That claim to historical accuracy is itself a political argument, and understanding it changes how you read the text. The inclusion of the Arrowfumi alternative versions is the most visible expression of this claim. By showing that it knows multiple versions of a myth and has chosen deliberately among them, the Nihongi is saying, this is not simply what we were told. This is what the evidence supports. That is a different kind of authority claim than the Kojiki's. The Kojiki claims authority because it preserves what was always true. The Nihongi claims authority because it has evaluated the evidence and selected the most credible account. The first is the authority of tradition. The second is the authority of scholarship. But the Nihongi's historiographical claims are not entirely distinguishable from its political claims. The evidence it evaluates and the sources it cites are predominantly the sources that support the account of the past that benefits the political order producing the text. The Bikj Chronicles, on which the Nihongi draws heavily for its diplomatic history, were written by refugees from a destroyed state who had settled in Japan, and whose own interests aligned with a positive account of the Japan-Bikj relationship. The oral genealogies submitted by provincial clans were submitted to a court that had the power to include or exclude them from the authoritative record. The Nihongi's scholarship is real, but it is not neutral. It is scholarship in the service of a particular political project, and the project shapes which evidence is admitted and which is set aside. The modern resonance here is the distinction between history as a scholarly enterprise and history as a political tool, a distinction that the Nihongi refuses to enforce, and that most national histories have refused to enforce ever since. every state that produces official history is navigating the same tension. The history needs to be credible enough to be believed, which requires engaging seriously with evidence. And it needs to be favorable enough to be useful, which requires selecting and framing evidence in particular ways. The Nihongi's balance between these demands is more sophisticated than most. Its inclusion of variant versions and its acknowledgement of diplomatic failures give it a credibility that purely triumphalist chronicles lack, but the tension is never fully resolved. The deepest contradiction of the Nihongi is this. It claims historical authority in the name of scholarship, while the history it produces is organized around a divine genealogy that no amount of scholarship can verify. The analytic form, the classical Chinese prose, the cited sources, the calibrated dates, all of these create a documentary apparatus that projects scholarly credibility onto a foundation that rests ultimately on myth. The transition from the mythological volumes to the historical volumes is presented as seamless, but the epistemological ground shifts completely at that transition. You cannot fact-check the creation of the world against external sources. You can fact-check diplomatic exchanges with the Tang court. The Nihongi places both in the same chronicle, uses the same formal apparatus for both, and relies on the credibility established by the historical volumes to lend authority to the mythological volumes and vice versa. It is a rhetorical achievement of considerable sophistication, and it is also, from an epistemological standpoint, a category error that the text manages through formal consistency rather than resolving through argument. Where does the Nihongi sit in the wider history of ideas? It belongs to the tradition of official dynastic history, a genre that exists in some form in almost every civilization that has developed writing and state institutions. The Chinese Zhengxi tradition, the Roman annals, the Byzantine chronicles, the Persian royal inscriptions, the Indian Puranas. All of these share with the Nihongi the project of constructing a past that validates a present political order. What distinguishes the Nihongi within that tradition is its particular combination of scholarly ambition and political function. Its engagement with foreign sources and foreign formal models while asserting indigenous authority. Its preservation of variant versions that give it an unusual transparency about its own editorial process. It is, among official national histories, one of the more honest about what it is, not because it is free of political purpose, but because it acknowledges the machinery of its own production more fully than most. What to carry forward from the Nihongi? The observation that a civilization's relationship with its outside, with the more powerful civilizations it imports from, the diplomatic peers it negotiates with, the enemies it fears, shapes its internal identity in ways that are never fully separable from that identity. Japan in 720 CE was Japanese in a way that was constituted partly by what it was not Tang China, not Beach, not any of the continental models it was so intensively importing. The identity was relational, built in the process of borrowing and refusing, absorbing and insisting on difference. That is not a peculiarity of 8th century Japan. It is the structure of every national identity that has ever been constructed in conversation with an outside. What is dangerous if taken as literal doctrine? The Nihongi's claim that centralization is equivalent to the restoration of proper order, that the dispersal of power to local or clan-based authorities is inherently problematic rather than potentially a form of valuable diversity, and that the state's account of its own history is the authoritative account. The Nihongi was used, in the Meiji period and beyond, to support the kind of authoritarian nationalism that presents centralized state authority as the natural and sacred expression of a unified people's identity. The text alone is not responsible for that use, but it provided the rhetorical raw material, and understanding that provision is part of reading the text honestly. Return to where we began. How do you become modern on someone else's terms without losing your own identity? After a week with the Nihongi, you do not have a final answer to that question. What you have is one of the most sustained and intelligent attempts at answering it that the ancient world produced. The answer is not simply correct or incorrect. It is a strategy of formal borrowing and substantive insistence, of scholarly credibility and political purpose, of universal form and particular content. It worked, for a time, in a specific set of circumstances. Understanding how it worked, and where it failed, and what it cost, is the work the Nihongi invites you to do. That's all for today on Libyth. Next Monday, we begin a new book. I'll tell you which one at the end of the week's video. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe. A new book every week. At least we try.